Hi guys, so before we get into it, a very quick disclaimer that you'll find all my other Amicus reviews in my Amicus playlist, and there will be spoilers today for Vault of Horror. Now, I didn't remember this one that well, but as I was going through all the stories the other night, it's not like I didn't recognise anything that was coming on screen. With each and every story, it was very much a case of, oh, it's that one, oh yeah, I remember this one, and so on. But based on my faint memories of watching this years ago, I did predict this would turn out to be one of the weakest of the 7. Now, in terms of how I'm going to go about reviewing this today, same as always, whenever I do an anthology review, I'm going to talk about each of the stories in turn, and then we'll have a conclusion at the end. But before all that, we will, of course, address the framing story. We start with 5 blokes getting onto an elevator in a really tall office building. They head down to the basement 2 room completely by accident, but once they get off the elevator they realise they can't get back on it. So they are therefore stuck under the ground, and all they can think to do at this point is take a seat until rescue arrives and tell each other the 5 tales that we are about to witness in person. All these characters seem to be very confused about how they even got on the elevator in the first place. I suspect they might actually be dead. This is by far, though, the weakest of all 7 Amicus framing stories for these anthology films, and I say that despite the fact that we still have From Beyond the Grave to go. But I can remember the framing story from that film. It's better than this elevator scenario. This whole setup feels like something that might have been cobbled together very late in production, the sort of thing that they might have only spent like 1 day filming, or maybe they'd intended to do something completely different but it fell through and they had to think this up at the last minute. I don't know, but it's just very, very basic. There's nothing to it. Yes, we were spoilt with Asylum, the previous film, but even so, there's not much to enjoy in this whole elevator scenario. It's a purely functional scene to get us into the main stories, and that is literally that. I'm also troubled by the fact that there's no women among this group of 5. It feels like we should have at least 1 female character. Now, I didn't mind Dr. Terror's House of Horrors being all male, because that scene on the train felt like a very male-dominated sort of situation. I could believe that everybody in that carriage would end up being male, but the idea that you could have 5 people get on an elevator in an office block and none of them be female is a stretch for me. I've worked in office blocks. There are more women than men in those places, trust me. So I feel like they should have had at least 1 female character in this film. I mean, it's something that you soon forget about when you get into the male stories, but I'll point it out anyway. But on the whole, I don't want to call it a weak framing story, but there's certainly very little to it. Midnight Mess is about a guy called Harold who is quite happy to murder everybody who gets in the way of him finding his sister, and then when he catches up with his sister he kills her as well, because this means that he will now inherit the family estate and not his sister. But no sooner has he taken care of all this, he wanders into the local cafe, but it turns out to be a vampire hideout, so he gets swiftly killed, and that's the end of the story. Now, the first thing to say about all this is that Harold is not only very evil, he's also very stupid. There is no way in the world he is getting away with his sister's murder in this, not a chance. Not only is he extremely careless with the forensic side of things, and, you know, I mean, he touches everything in that apartment, but there are so many people who have seen him hanging around outside his sister's house. He's already been to the vampire cafe long before he then kills his sister. And if you look at it from the police's point of view, I mean, you've got this young woman in line to suddenly inherit stuff, and then she's murdered a few days later. And the next in line to inherit everything is the brother who was seen hanging around outside her house that same day. Yeah, I think the brother is absolutely 100% going to prison, if you ask me. So maybe it's just for the best that he dies before the end of this story. Now, leaving aside some of the dodgy logic in this, I did really enjoy this one. The murders, when they happen, are total surprises from beginning to end, and all the stuff in the cafe sends a real shiver up my spine, especially that moment where Harold stands up and realises that he's done for, because he has a moment where you can see it on his face. He realises that he's not getting out of this room. And even though Harold is a complete twat, I still felt a little bit sorry for him. There's some great imagery at the end of this as well. When he's hanging upside down and the wine's just coming out of his throat into all the wine glasses, it's kind of a cool look, even though it is quite horrific. So I do like this as a first story. It's a fun little vampire tale. Next up we have The Neat Job. So the main guy in this is Terry Thomas. Now, I don't think I've seen him in anything else apart from this, and yet I instantly recognised this guy because I'm pretty sure he was in a commercial in the UK back when I was a kid, and I've always remembered him from that. But it must have been a hell of a long time ago, because he died in 1990 apparently, unless the commercial I remember was simply using his likeness, which is possible. But it's just strange that I would remember him from one commercial like so long ago, unless I have seen him in something and just forgotten. But I don't think so. But he's so good in this. He plays a guy who's getting married for the first time in maybe his late 50s, but he's got no business marrying anybody because he doesn't have a romantic bone in his body. He's obsessed with neatness, like he's got proper OCD. He wants everything exactly as he wants, and he gets really agitated when somebody gets even a hair out of place. And his wife just isn't that kind of person, so she immediately gets really frustrated with this whole living situation, but she's a little bit too timid to do anything about it properly, so she's just suffering in silence. It's basically domestic abuse, and yeah, it is a little bit uncomfortable to watch, but at the same time I was really enjoying it as a drama. I could have watched a longer version of this easily because it was so good, so well acted as well. And when the finale comes with the hammer kill, it's a gloriously satisfying moment. It's the perfect end. I don't think you could have ended it any other way, given that it is a short horror story. Now, there is a little bit of a punchline which happens after that, where the woman puts all the body parts of her husband into a million jars, but I kind of think that joke misses the mark a little bit. Now, if the wife had just cut Terry Thomas, I can't remember his character name, if she just cut him into two with a saw and put the two halves of him in two buckets in the corner of the cellar, that would have been fine. You would have achieved the same joke, but it would have been believable. I could believe that she might spend a minute or so cutting him into two, just so he can fit perfectly into a couple of buckets, and then she's like, what do you think of my neatness now, hubby? But the idea that she would spend like hours and hours cutting him into bits that small, you know, taking it too far. Like, she's not that unhinged. She's just a normal woman who fell into this bad situation. Yeah, it sent her a bit cuckoo, but not that far out. So the ending misses the mark a little bit, but everything up until then is fantastic. And the two central performances, the only performances actually in this thing, I don't think there's any side characters from memory. Absolutely wonderful. For very different reasons, these might actually be the two best performances in the movie. So in this one we have Kurt Jurgens, who would go on to play Stromberg in The Spy Who Loved Me. He is visiting Egypt in this with his wife, or maybe it's India. It feels like one of those two countries, but I'm not sure which, but it doesn't matter. Jurgens, I don't know his character name, he is a magician, and so is his wife, and he thinks that surely on this holiday he will find at least one new trick he can use in his act back home. And lo and behold, he stumbles across this gorgeous young Indian woman who has an amazing trick. So with her little flute thing, she can make a rope come out of her bucket, and it stands up perfectly straight so that you can climb on it, and then with the same tune you can make the rope retract. But when you reach into the bucket, it'll just be a loose rope. So this is clearly actual magic that's happening here, and Kurt Jurgens thinks that it would be the perfect thing for him to introduce into his act back home. So he offers a lot of money to this woman for this trick, but she refuses, because it's a trick that's been passed down the generations. She doesn't want to lose it. So in response to this, Kurt Jurgens basically decides to run her through with a cutlass. It's the most callous act you can think of. And in the immediate aftermath, he feels no shame. His wife watches the whole thing and she's absolutely fine with it as well. This is the third story we've had up to this point, and it's very noticeable to me that all the main characters are absolute twats. In fact, Terry Thomas is probably the least evil main character we've had up to this point, which is really saying something. But of course, Jurgens and his wife are not going to get a happy ending. That's not how these stories work. It turns out that the rope and bucket are sentient, and therefore they want to get revenge for the death of their mistress. So this thing, it swiftly kills the husband and wife. I particularly like the death of the wife. So she is in the process of trying out this trick. She's climbing on the rope, and then her face contorts into utter agony because she spotted something just off camera, and then she disappears into the ether. And we never find out what happened to her, but it's just so weird how she clearly saw something utterly horrific to get that kind of reaction out of her, but we'll never find out what. But the way that death is shot, I think, is extremely creepy. The death of Jurgens is less impressive. I mean, he's basically running around the room and the rope is acting as a kind of whip trying to get him, and eventually it strangles him to death. So we get the appropriate ending that you'll always get in a story like this. I would say it's just about the weakest of the three stories up to this point, but I like that it takes place in a different country, an exotic country at that. It just gives us a different flavour to sample at this point of the movie. Bargain of Death, or is it Bargain of Terror, involves a couple of absolute plonkers who try and pull off a life insurance scam. So one of them is going to take a drug that will sufficiently reduce his heart rate enough that he can be declared dead and buried in a coffin. Meanwhile, his buddy above ground is going to claim the life insurance money and then go back to the graveyard and dig up his friend, and the two of them will live happily ever after on the spoils. As a plan, it's an absolute nonsense. I mean, there are so many things that could go wrong with this. The guy in the coffin could die from the drug before he even gets the chance to run out of air. And the idea that you could fool the medical examiner, the insurance company, the police, it's asking a lot. And then at least one of these two would have to stay off the grid for the rest of their lives. Nobody's ever going to attempt this. And it's quite amusing to me that the guy in the coffin never once questions whether his friend will actually come back for him. "Oh, it's the perfect plan," he says at one point, and I'm thinking, no, it's not. It's a stupid and very dangerous plan. Now, if it was just this that I had a problem with this story, that would be fine, but there are so many other gaps in logic in this whole thing, and wild coincidences where the chances of certain things happening are just astronomical. I was actually getting ready to come on camera and completely rip this story to shreds, but almost at the last minute, actually, I thought to myself, was this meant as a black comedy? Because it's impossible for there to be this many things wrong with the same short story, surely. It must have been intended as some kind of farce, and if you view it through that lens, I guess it's all right. I mean, I still found it quite entertaining, but I'm not really into comedic horror, and to be honest, I'm not even into coffin horror. I mean, there was a segment in one of the recent VHS films where a woman buries herself in a coffin for some reason that I've forgotten, and that was actually my least favourite story on that anthology, and I still haven't forgotten that segment from Kill Bill 2 where the bride ends up buried in a coffin. That is easily the most monotonous part of that whole saga. So this could be a taste thing with me. I just didn't like the tone of this story, maybe. I just like things in a story to make sense, and I don't like wild coincidences. Everything has a place, and there's a place for everything, as they say. Don't know where I just pulled that from. How weird. The final story is a good one, and thank God, because it's also the longest in the anthology by far. This must be twice the length of any of the other stories, surely. So here we've got a painter who, to my mind, looks a lot like Simon Whitlock, the darts player. And he's wronged by a group of businessmen over his painting, so he decides to get revenge. He pays for some voodoo, and what this means is that anything he paints, if he then destroys that painting, whatever was in the picture will be destroyed for real. So of course he starts painting pictures of the con men and destroying those paintings, and that means that these con men die for real. Now, I couldn't really get behind any of the characters in this story. The main painter is essentially a mass murderer who has no justification for what he's doing. Just because somebody's conned you, it doesn't mean you have the right to go and kill that person. And the con men in this are highly immoral, men who feel no guilt about ripping people off, so I didn't really care for them either. So I was kind of left to just enjoy the macabre elements of this whole thing, and that's fine, because there are some fun kills to be had in this story. The one with the guy who gets his hands chopped off is one of the worst cases of bad health and safety at work I've ever seen in my life. I mean, why anybody would put their hands under a guillotine and just assume that it's not going to malfunction and come crashing down on you, absolutely beyond me. The kill with, I forget his name, the guy who plays Marcus Brody in Indiana Jones, you can see the terror on his face as he's struggling to avoid pulling the gun on himself. And the final death of the painter, as predictable as it is deliciously squirmy, a good way to end. I guess there are two morals to this story that we should take heed of. Firstly, don't pursue the path of revenge. And secondly, don't be so vain that you would paint pictures of yourself, paint pictures of other people instead, just in case people start dying when the pictures get destroyed. I'm not going to say much more about the epilogue to the elevator section. This film strangely assumes that we won't have already seen Dr. Terror's House of Horrors and Tales from the Crypt, because when the reveal comes that all these men are dead, I think we're meant to be surprised, but newsflash, we're not. This is like the third or fourth time that this has happened in this franchise now. Something different next time, please. Oh, Peter Cushing in a shop, you say? That will be just fine, thank you. In terms of Blu-ray release, I have held this up on camera before when I did my Tales from the Crypt review, because it's a double film release, which is fine by me. It saves me a bit of space on my shelf. Not too much in the way of features, but the main thing is that these films both look terrific on this disc. Shall we get to the bag of terror? I think we shall. It's time for the score. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4 bloody axes out of 5. The only thing I don't like about this film really is the wraparound story, and one of the stories is a bit too much of a black comedy for me. But given that there are 5 main stories, I think there's a good amount of consistent quality about this film to justify 4 out of 5. And if I do still think that this one might be one of the weaker ones in the series, that's only because all of these films are extremely good, really. One of them's got to be the worst one, right? Although at this point, I'd probably say that it's more likely to be Torture Garden for me than Vault of Horror. No reading section today. I have barely moved the dial on Stephen King's The Stand since my last review. I've maybe gone from like page 400 to page 500. Not worth having another section just to mention that. Maybe next time I'll have more progress to report. But for now, that's all for today. I will see you all again next time. Bye-bye.